make Charlie your father, Bibbs. You can't do that, can you? I am not saying he's a great man. Willie Loman never earned a lot of money. His name was never in the paper. He's not the finest character that ever lived. But he's a human being. And a terrible thing is happening to him. So attention must be paid. He must not be allowed to fall into his grave like an old dog. Attention. Attention must finally be paid to such a person. You called him crazy?
Mom, I didn't...
Wait a minute. A lot of people think he's lost his balance, but you don't have to be very smart to know what his trouble is. The man is exhausted.
Sure.
A small man can be just as exhausted as a great man.
Charlie? Bernard? Willie himself? Biff? Well, Leica nominates Charlie. In Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, Charlie's character can be interpreted as choral, providing a perspective that contrasts and comments on the events and characters in the play. Charlie, Willie Loman's neighbor and friend, is a figure who stands somewhat apart from the main action, offering insights and commentary on the events and characters. Charlie's role as a choral character can be justified using the criteria outlined in the excerpt from A&H. They describe a choral character as someone who indeed stands apart from the action, that's such an important phrase, and gives the audience a unique perspective through comments. Now, Adriana nominates Ben and the woman, quote, within the haunting imagery, Death of a Salesman, the two main choral characters who disrupt and influence Willie's internal thought as well as external beliefs are both his brother Ben and his lover, only known as the woman. Adriana goes on to offer a good discussion of both these characters' different sorts of disruption. The question arises, however, do choral characters indeed tend to be disruptors of the tragedies of which they are a part, whether physical or mental in their disruption? Note again A&H's stand-apart criterion. Ben and the women, or the woman rather, get into it with Willie. And I want you to think back for a moment to Antigone, in the chorus in Antigone, which is so exemplary. The chorus in Antigone, you will recall, has some doubts about some of the things that Crayon does over the course of the drama, and also now and then offers some rather cruel characterizations of Antigone herself to Antigone's face, and she is not welcome. She does not welcome some of the things that they have to say to her. But you will recall, they never really change anybody's mind. They never really act in such a way as to create change in the world of the play. They are more like sounding boards, right? These sorts of emotional sounding boards over there on the side that help perhaps the main characters to clarify their own feelings, to arrive at a sharper delineation of their own attitudes when they hear them bounce back to them, and characterized in some cases by the chorus. What they don't do is disrupt the way that, as Adriana has put it so well, the strength of Adriana's argument actually is, with all the detail you get into Adriana, actually disqualifies these two because you do such a good job of showing what disruptors they are. I mean, Ben really does change Charlie's, Ben is of course a phantom inside Charlie, but Ben acting in this phantasmic or phantasmatic way does change the course of the drama. He's the one who tells, kind of talks indirectly Willie into, committing suicide at the end. The lover, you will recall, right, is someone who plays a part in the plot. She's just too involved in the action to really qualify, right? Well, I'll share Leica's illustration of her claim, which is notably rich in evidence, all the more reason to be shared, right? Quote, one of Charlie's notable quotes in Death of a Salesman that exemplifies his role as a choral character comes from Act 2. Charlie says during a conversation with Willie Loman, "Nobody das't blame this man. You don't understand. Willie was a salesman. And for a salesman, there was no rock bottom to the life. He don't put a bolt to a nut. He don't tell you the law, give you medicine. He's a man way out there in the blue, riding on a smile and a shoe shine." It's just such a great line, isn't it? This quote encapsulates Charlie's understanding of Willie's struggles and the nature of the salesman's life. You'll notice it doesn't really change anything, right, in the course of the play. Nobody having heard this characterization, this encapsulation, has his or her conduct shifted around one way or the other. Charlie acknowledges the complexities of Willie's situation and the pressure he faces to maintain his image and provide for his family. Through this statement, Charlie not only expresses empathy for Willie, but also offers insight into the play's broader themes, such as the illusion of the American dream and the crushing weight of social expectation. Well, yes, that's all I can say. And I think a good case here is made once the evidence is sifted through, right? And we have a nice quote in support of the kind of thing that Charlie says repeatedly. Good case is made for Charlie as probably our best candidate for this role in this contemporary, relatively contemporary, this modern drama, which nobody would take for a Greek tragedy, and yet which does seem to, sustain some of these conventions of Greek tragedy. We do have a sense, when we read through what Charlie has to say, that he is occupying that position that is usually occupied by the chorus and sustaining that function into this modern transformation of tragedy. Now, there's some stuff down below on the page here that I'm not going to read through aloud, but you could have a quick look at it because I think it's kind of interesting, especially if you're interested in this question as something going forward.
Okay, wait a second, time out. Let's just take a moment here, okay, to make an important point. Of course, to have your chorus or choral character affect the hero's actions at all, is that not to do something innovative? Isn't it a stretch? Isn't it to stretch a rule of the genre? Isn't it to modify a convention? I want to introduce this notion of a literary convention, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit below, right? It's been said that the chorus, which sees Clytemnestra in the play Agamemnon, which is one of the great Greek tragedies, it's been said that the chorus in that play, which sees Clytemnestra, knife in hand, approach Agamemnon as he sits in his bath, is not allowed to warn him. Okay, bearing witness to what's about to happen, they're not allowed to rush in and save him. It's just against the rules. Choruses can't do things like that. Okay, they can't be involved. It's not a matter of their simply not being involved. It goes against the convention, the literary, as it were, kind of unspoken agreement and expectation, okay, of authors who write in these particular genres. But think about what happens when we get more modern, right? And you get the feeling that a lot of these old genres, they're not being scrapped. They're being, in various ways, investigated and modified and kind of exploited is maybe the best word for them, right? What do we have, for example, in trifles? I want you to think about this. Imagine that the two women, you remember them, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, a chorus of two. Imagine them as the chorus of that play. That was originally going to be one of your items. Well, for whatever reason. A chorus of two uniting in the end to save a small t tragic heroine, Mrs. Wright, simply, if I think quite devilishly, by resuming choral convention and refusing to intervene in the action. Kind of go back to being a chorus, right? Start out maybe as a chorus, nobody's paying much attention to them. They're offering community commentary. You see the men there in the, on the scene early on as constituting a kind of competitive chorus, a rival chorus made of the men, which I think is a very interesting way of reading the play, right? Maybe with the possible exception of the district commissioner, right, or the DA, as it were, who was actually doing the investigating, right? It seems a little bit too involved, but the other two are just there to kind of offer statements, right? The women seem to be that as well, and you can imagine the play continuing with the two of them kind of falling into the background and showing up now and then to offer comments, to say this, to say that. But in fact, we see them take the stage, take center stage. Mrs. Wright is off stage. Tragedy is off stage, and we have this kind of subsection of tragedy, which features choral characters, if you will, right? Who, in fact, to the extent that there's any action in the play, they're the ones who act, and there's not much action in the play. I mean, all they really do is look in a bag, find something that's dead, and decide to leave it there, right? Even as they comment upon it. Let me reread that sentence. Resuming choral convention, this chorus of two, uniting in the end to resume choral convention and refuse to intervene in the action, which they could have done by presenting the dead bird to the men, even as they comment upon it, okay? Even as they, throughout, and I think even at the very end, are commenting upon the action. They, at the end, could, that's consistent throughout, but at the end they could go back to just a commentary, right? Just the function of commentary is their only function at the very end. And you can see this as a devilish bit of fun. The topic isn't fun, but aesthetically, you can imagine that a glass bell is in fact doing some very interesting things here that are fairly playful in their own way. Okay, so here's a generalization. Modern plays monkey with a convention. It's a pretty simple point, but I think it's a good one, right? And one that's very worth bearing in mind as we try to understand literary history and try to prepare ourselves to be English majors whose careers are going to be investigations of literary history. Modern plays monkey with the conventions. These long established rules of the genre get played with, monkeyed around with by moderns who want to write something like a tragedy, right? But don't feel that the old style, the old form is precisely fits what they're up to. Note how they do not, here's an important distinction. Note how these modern plays do not reject or ignore those conventions. Even if they do not venerate and obey them, they don't reject or ignore them. That's not the way to do it. That's not the way to get yourself taken seriously. It would appear when we look at literary history, you don't ignore, reject wholesale, right? You invoke and then transform. That seems to be the way to do it. And again, it speaks to the staying power of genre as much as it does to anything else, which was the whole point of our the last video, right? Was one of the big points of the last video was this remarkable staying power and stability of genre. At the same time, mutability of genre, the mutability and longevity of genre. Stability in some sort of essential core is stable, right, of these genres, even as they undergo this mutation. So they're still recognizable as tragedy or the tragic mode. But nobody would say that that's a Greek tragedy when you read Trifles, or you read Chekhov, or you read this play. Just let me note in passing what's down here, and I hope it's legible, which is in accordance with that star up above just after the first sentence. The first sentence was, but of course to have your chorus or choral character affect the hero's actions at all is to do something innovative, right? Well, do note how some critics think that an evidently passive and at best reactive Greek chorus, such as we have in Antigone, is more active and involved than we tend to recognize. You know, in other words, that fundamental premise of the inactivity of the chorus is something that some critics have called into question. Now, I don't feel that they have done so all that compellingly, but it's still a very interesting claim. Hawthorne, for example, notes how many critics have long recognized how the chorus in Greek tragedies may be clearly, quote, clearly and directly involved in the action by doing such things as arguing, supplicating, or deceiving. And Hawthorne goes on to say, look, even when they're silent, they're just standing there, they make a difference. They're in a sense involved in the action. Yeah, but others, you know, they'll retort such things, right? That line, doing such things as arguing, supplicating, or deceiving. Well, these things, aren't they to be distinguished from things like burying, issuing decrees, committing suicide, right? Drawing your sword on your father, as Hymen does, right? I mean, there's certain actions that are really actions. Then there are other actions that are kind of like if you stretch, you know, when the Greek chorus wants to get into a discussion about with Crayon about the lawfulness of what he's doing, okay? And they end up celebrating some of the things that he is, some of his premises and whatnot. Is that really action at the same level as what Hymen is doing when he draws his sword? So, you know, you have an argument about this. You have debate on this whole question of whether that convention, as we recognize it, is really there, okay? But I think the consensus is that there is a difference between what a choral character is doing on a stage and what a non-choral character who's involved in the action is doing on the stage. For fans of Miss Frances and of Ben, perhaps, as candidates or nominees for the choral character, Barazzato and Catrombone might come to your assistance. They argue that choral groups assume different intra-dramatic, which means within the drama itself, identities according to the specific plots in which they partake. A similar attention to the choral intra-dramatic identity, which just means the identity taken up by the chorus in whatever drama he or she or it happens to be a part of, has provided a strong corrective against those interpreters who make too straightforward identifications between the tragic course and the civic collectivity, which is something we've been doing, right? That's what I was talking about before when I said I don't know about Miss Frances or I don't know about Ben, because what do they represent? Aren't they a bit elliptical and eccentric and a bit out there, as I said, a bit far out, right? Spatially, economically, socially. Arguing against such politicizing views of the tragic course, the famous Gold in 1996 convincingly maintains that tragic choruses quite often embody social groups that were perceived as marginal within Athenian 5th century society. So if you go back again, go back to the original convention as it was established by the Greeks, and you might find that there are, that there's a kind of a range of possibility with respect to the relationship between the chorus and the community surrounding the action of the play, right? Now, in Antigone, there's no doubt about it. They are like elders. They're referred to as old men, you will recall. They're like the city fathers. They're like the guys at the barbershop, but probably if one of the guys at the barbershop is also mayor of the town, right? That's who they are in Antigone, and that's who they are in lots of Greek tragedies, okay? But every now and then, as Gold argues, you get them representing something that's a little bit off, a little bit eccentric, a little bit out there, right? The chorus. And it's interesting. There isn't a one-to-one match between the chorus necessarily, even when you go back to the Greeks, in every tragedy between the chorus and the surrounding, fairly conventional-minded, okay, community. And I think that's really interesting to keep that open as a possibility here of, for example, Miss Frances, whom you see here in a certain production of the play being kind of romanced by Willie, and how would that scornful laugh, as some of you said, might itself constitute a choral comment. Where we've been heading this whole time is towards a concept, or a notion at least, of the literary convention and the power of conventions. I think this is no surprise to you if you're still with me. To quote the Abrams and Harpham glossary, they have a wonderful, wonderfully helpful entry on this question. Quote, conventions are conspicuous features of subject matter, form, or technique that occur repeatedly in works of literature. Conventions, in a sense, may be recurrent types of character, choral character, turns of plot, reversal of the old tragedy, forms of versification, the sonnet, or kinds of diction and style, iambic pentameter in poetry. Stock characters such as the Elizabethan braggart soldier, or the languishing and fainting heroine of Victorian fiction, or the sad young men of the lost generation novels of the 1920s were among the conventions of their literary eras. And it's interesting how that Elizabethan braggart soldier is still around. I mean, look at, I don't know about Band of Brothers, but look at, for example, Saving Private Ryan, and the character played by Edward, I almost said Norton, what's his last name? You know the guy I'm talking about. He plays the guy with the big gun who complains a lot. And he might not be the best example of the braggart, but I think I don't know, Saving Private Ryan, maybe it's the character is the sniper, right? But you have these conventional figures who are still with us, right? Who were introduced a long time ago. To continue, the abrupt reform of the villain at the end of the last act was a common convention of melodrama. Euphuism, which is high and flowery language in prose, and the Petrarchan and metaphysical conceits in verse were conventional devices of style. It is now just as much a matter of literary convention to be outspoken on sexual matters as it was to be reticent in the age of Charles Dickens and George Eliot. So these conventions do change. It's over time, as we've seen, there's a kind of mutability of literary genre and a mutability of literary convention as well. But I think what's would have been a better note to end on here, it seems to me, would have been how stable they are over time, even though, of course, there are all kinds of innovations upon them and changes and mutations. It's remarkable how you can still find them from very earlier works. They don't just get scrapped every generation and we form a whole new set of them. That's not the way it works. Yeah, a final word on conventions. You associate the word convention probably with the adjective conventional, which is not necessarily a term of approbation. When I think of very conventional people I know, I tend to think of them as fairly shallow people. They just observe the rules and they do what they've been told to do and they do what they've been taught to do and they don't innovate and they don't invent. Okay? Here's what Harpham and Abrams have to say on that topic. Quote, invention was originally a term used in theories of rhetoric and later in literary criticism to signify the finding of the subject matter by an orator or a poet. It then came to signify innovative elements in a work in contrast to the deliberate imitation of the forms and subjects of prior literary models. And you can see how that would work to the extent that you're imitative of forms and subjects of prior literary models, you're being very conventional. At the present time, invention is often opposed to convention in sense 2 above, which is the sense that was quoted in the previous plate, to signify the inauguration by a writer of an unprecedented subject or theme or form or style, and the resulting work is said to possess originality. Who would not want to be thought original, right? So does that mean you need to be very inventive, give yourself over to invention, and try to be as unconventional as possible. Try not to observe conventions. Try to reject all the conventions, right? Is that the way it works? Repeatedly in the history of literature, innovative writers such as John Donne, Walt Whitman, James Joyce, or Virginia Woolf rebel against reigning conventions of their time to produce highly original works, only to have their inventions imitated by other writers who thereby convert literary novelties into an additional set of literary conventions. And I think we've already seen some evidence of this when we're talking about genre, right? Where what looked to be this kind of mutation, it was taking us pretty far outside of the province of recognizable tragedy, ends up becoming this thing called, by way of its approach to comedy, this thing called tragicomedy, and has its own set of literary conventions that grow up in its own, what seemed to be a brand new and distinct field, that had nothing to do and scorn the whole notion of a convention, the whole notion of a genre, suddenly becomes a genre in its own right with its own set of conventions. Okay, and you even look at Joyce and Woolf and Whitman and Donne, and I think what you'll see is, yes, there's radical innovation, but at the same time, once again, their innovations are such that you can see the conventions that they're transforming and transmogrifying. Okay, you can see them. You can see the conventions there. It's not as though it's just written in a vacuum, as though there's been no history whatsoever. And here Harpham and Abrams go on to say something similar to what I just said. There's nothing either good or bad in the extent or obviousness of conformity to pre-existing conventions. All depends on the effectiveness of the use an individual writer makes of them. The pastoral elegy, for example, is one of the most conspicuously convention-bound of literary forms. Yet in Lycidas, John Milton achieved what, by wide critical agreement, ranks as one of the greatest lyrics in the language. He did this by employing the ancient pastoral rituals, but not just imitating them. He imitated them, and he transformed them and employed them with freshness, a kind of newness and novelty and power, so as to absorb an individual's death into the universal human experience and to add to his voice the resonance of earlier pastoral laments for a poet who died young. So he very much wanted his voice to be heard as a kind of echo, okay, for all its own pitch, its own novel, unique pitch and tone and timbre. He didn't want you to forget about the voices that went before, that were heard before in the tradition. He wanted to line up his voice as the latest instance of that kind of expression of voice, that kind of pitch and timbre in tenor, okay? And so, once again, I think it shows the extent to which literary innovation, literary innovation and tradition kind of split the difference between them, right? And you rarely see a literary innovation that really takes hold of us and becomes powerful, okay, and becomes compelling, right? Except by way of its own, well, by way, number one, of the fact that it's, or the degree to which it itself gets imitated, therefore showing the power of imitation and the power of convention, or by showing That's, or rather, you see it in its power by the degree to which, in fact, it participates in this kind of tradition and does not forget previous literary conventions, okay, even as it innovates upon them. But in fact, the emphasis becomes or falls on that, upon them, right, upon the foundations that exist already. That's the way literary history tends to work. Now, this video has been going on long enough, so I'm going to let you go at this point. Just to mention that Trofimov, okay, who a picture of whom Ethan Hawke. You thought it was Ethan Hawke. No, that was Trofimov in the last plate. Okay. Those of you who responded to the Trofimov prompt will have a separate, not a video, but a separate little item devoted to what the good work that you did. Okay, so farewell for now.